For those of you who I haven't met, my name is Kirsten Olson. I'm the interim director of the Unruh Institute of Politics this semester. I think I know most of you, but some of you. I'd like to go ahead and introduce our panel. To my left is Bert Gibson. He's the chief copy editor of the USC Daily Trojan. Immediately to my right is our friend Reed Galen, who is currently the owner of Jedburghs, LLC. He was once an adjunct professor at the USC Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism. Right on, Reed. He's also a former managing director at Mercury Public Affairs and the deputy campaign manager for John McCain in 2008 and Californians for Schwarzenegger in 2006. To his right is Giuseppe Robalino, who's the director of political affairs and strategy for the USC College Republicans. To his right is our guest, Angelica Solis, who's the director of community development for the Youth Policy Institute of Los Angeles and the former executive director of the Alliance for a Better Community. And to her right is Chris Patterson, a member of the USC College Democrats and also a student worker at the Unruh Institute of Politics. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished panel. Okay, so today's discussion is about the war on poverty, which of course is a very, very global topic. So we hope to cover many elements of the discussion, but just as a reminder to you all about the format of the lunch today, we'll be discussing, querying our panel for the first half an hour, and then at the midpoint we'll turn it over to you and give you the opportunity to ask each of our panelists a question. So our beginning question is to raise the discussion by talking about this new initiative that the president has announced, announcing promise zones throughout the country, throughout the United States. The designation of a city to be called a promise zone is a very distinct honor, and with it, it brings a lot of federal funding to help eliminate poverty in that particular city. So Los Angeles was recently named one of these designated promise zones. And there are 5 areas of Los Angeles, Pico Union, Westlake, Koreatown, East Hollywood, and Hollywood, that were particularly designated to be recipients of these funds. So my first question is to our panelist, Angelica. And we wanted to ask you specifically, what does this mean for Los Angeles? Of course, it's a very broad designation to be awarded these funds, and there'll be a lot of various entities of Los Angeles that will receive these funds. But just generally speaking, where do you see the majority of these funds being directed, and who will be the primary beneficiaries?
I think certainly the designation is a real opportunity for the city of Los Angeles. I do think, however, that there is a huge fact that is really important when we talk about the promise zone and the Los Angeles promise zone. So there actually aren't any funds attached to the promise zone. So I know that it's been widely reported that there are funds that are going to be coming to Los Angeles as a result of the promise zone. But I think the distinction to be very clear about is that it's a designation. So what it does is it provides the city of Los Angeles to apply for competitive federal funding. It doesn't guarantee any of the federal funding. It just means that through the application process, there will be sort of a check mark box that we would be able to check off, indicating that we have the promise zone designation. What it means is potentially the opportunity to create a very clear strategic plan for the zone and for the neighborhoods in the zone that would ultimately lead to the creation of jobs, improved educational programming and outcomes, public housing that is accessible to communities, that is designed with mixed use intent, and increased public safety potentially as well by being able to leverage a lot of the existing programs that are in place through the City of Los Angeles and the police department, as well as some programs that are being run by community-based organizations. It's also an opportunity to be able to sort of for the first time take the resources that are available between community-based organizations, between city and county governments, and also between the philanthropic community to really leverage a lot of the resources that will go into the community in a very planned out, strategic way so that it does lead to outcomes that lead to improved quality of life for the residents and the community members and the businesses that are part of the Promise Zone.
Thank you. There are some, as with every program, there are certainly proponents and opponents. And for this program, I think globally and specifically, there are some folks that maybe would object to the way the federal government is approaching these policies that they claim to be best policies for each individual city. So there are some critics who say that, you know, this may end up actually hurting folks who are economically disadvantaged, and for reasons that have implications for gentrification, for reasons that have implications for, you know, unequal opportunities for who's chosen and who's not. So I think I'll follow up with a question to our friend Reed Galen here to ask him, you know, would a program like this end up hurting folks who are economically disadvantaged? Is that a possibility?
I suppose it could. I think it has to succeed first, and if gentrification is occurring, I think that probably means that there's been some success economically. Gentrification is a fact of life. I don't necessarily think it's a good thing, but it does happen. You know, the idea that implementing a program to help people is going to ultimately hurt them, that sounds like a guy who wanted a quote in the newspaper, to be honest with you. Like, he had to be a contrarian. I don't know what the timeline is for these programs, but I'm not sure that, you know, ultimately if it's going to harm them. I think that's a far-fetched thing. I think the question is, you know, how many people can it help is the better question. Will it help people? Will the outcomes designed by the Institute ultimately come to fruition? And if the downside is that crime goes down, education improves, and economic development occurs, then I have a hard time believing that's a bad thing for most of the people in those neighborhoods.
Chris, would you like to comment on that?
Sure. I mean, I think that anytime you're having a discussion about affordable housing or transportation in low-income areas in the U.S., I think it's probably a good thing. What most people don't realize is that the way we measure poverty and the way that poverty occurs in our country has changed a lot over the past several decades. It's a lot more suburban now. In addition, when the federal poverty line was created, it was created to assume that people's income was mostly going towards paying for food, where in the status quo, much of it goes to paying for housing, much of it goes to paying for transportation, and those are really the largest costs that people face. So when we're talking about, you know, making sure there's more public housing, making sure there's more affordable housing for low-income people, we're obviously decreasing a lot of the burden on them that allow them to devote more of their incomes to other things and to really focus on, you know, not spending as much of their income on paying for housing, transportation, and to focus on getting out of poverty and other economic opportunities.
When you take a look at the Promise Zones projects in particular on the White House website, what's very interesting is that, in a way, it's broad enough to where both parties can agree on a lot of the goals that it specifies. If you look at exactly what the Promise Zones are promising LA, they are using things that will be greatly supported by conservatives, such as using private business, increasing access to career training, which back in the late 1990s in the Clinton era was hugely debated back when Newt Gingrich was Speaker of the House, which is to implement work requirements in order to have welfare reform in '96. And so these are a lot of things that it's an interesting mix when you look at them, that this with the career training eliminating the red tape in government caused by previous government programs for funding, it really streamlines. Now, we were talking earlier how interesting it is that a government program had to be created to then undo the red tape of another government program. But the thing is that this is government recognizing that, you know, something may have gone wrong and we're going to move forward to try to improve it. Now, I suppose at the end of the day, where there could be some debate is on how you're going to implement access to affordable public housing and spending on public works projects such as transit and public transportation. Public transportation is a big one. It's debated. I'm from Orange County. When we're having a high-speed rail project, and I'm not trying to necessarily put 100% parallels between these because these are two totally different situations. However, once you start discussing public transit, are the jobs going to be created working for the government? Would be a question. Increasing the payroll of maybe the city government to pay employees working for public transit? Or is the idea that you're going to increase public transit so people can go to private sector jobs? So you have to balance the deficit, the amount of public spending, and to see whether or not you will get that return on investment. And affordable housing, the question there would be, how can we leverage partnerships with those private companies, private developers, to make this a fiscally sound investment? And I think that's kind of what it comes down to the end of the day. And I think that we kind of have to go forward to exactly see how it would play out. Because there are many ways where this could really succeed, and there could be a few pitfalls, but there could also be a few pitfalls. But it's just a matter of moving forward and seeing how it plays out.
What have been the major successes, for our professional panelists, what have been the major successes and failings of this war on poverty, and how can we apply these lessons to improve current anti-poverty programs?
I think some of the major successes of President Johnson's war on poverty have been quite a few. I mean, I think one of the things that is really important to understand when we're talking about poverty and when we're talking about different initiatives that are set to target the issue of poverty in this country is that there are a lot of interrelated issues that impact conditions under which communities are exposed to poverty. So while you may have a program that is designated to improve housing in a community, I think that was one of the things under President Johnson's war on poverty in terms of investing in public housing helped support communities that were really struggling. But I think what we've learned is that addressing the issue of housing alone is not enough to be able to lift communities out of poverty. You also have to look at the neighborhoods that surround the public housing, right? So what kind of jobs are available to these communities? What are the public safety concerns to communities around public housing? And I think that's one of the lessons that we've learned is that you can't isolate a lot of these initiatives, that they really have to be taken more comprehensively and looked more comprehensively in order for there to be a long-term impact. And that's one of the goals of the Promise Zone, is to be able to break up some of these silos, and so that when we are talking about housing, we're also having conversations about transportation, about public safety, about open space.
I would say, I think a lot of what you said is right. I think that if the biggest failure is probably still how many folks we have that live consistently below the poverty line, and frankly, the intergenerational aspect of that. How many folks very well might be born into public housing, grow up in public housing, have children or family in public housing, and end up dying there, all in the same neighborhood where their parents and grandparents potentially lived. I think if there's an indictment, I don't think it's the idea or the ideals behind it. I think it's the execution. Now, I think the other biggest issue is something that governments tend to do, and it's because this is how things work when you have a country of 300 million plus people, is that there is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all thing that works for anybody, and certainly not any large group. And the larger the group, the worse it works. And so I think at the time, the world was a very, very different place, right? We were still a manufacturing hub. We had a still growing middle class. We had wages increasing year over year. Now we are in a place where frankly, I think something that we need to talk about, and I think the holistic way to look at this is really important, is we don't make a lot of stuff anymore. In fact, we make very little. And frankly, the stuff we make, we need even less people to do it. So not only do these folks live in tough neighborhoods, they don't get a great education, they're surrounded by drugs and crime, even if they get through high school, which they might not, they very well might not. Once you get them out of high school, can you get them into college? And if you can't, what are these folks going to do to make a living, you know, at some sort of reasonable wage? And so I think if again, the ideals behind them are good, but again, I think that any time you try and apply anything to millions of people writ large, people will fall through the cracks, and ultimately, you know, a bureaucratic sort of sclerosis takes place, because that's what bureaucracies do.
Chris, you look at it.
Yeah, I think that the fact that these programs are federal is a little deceptive in terms of how you look at how they're actually applied. If you look at the way that the federal government funds poverty programs, there's several that are funded like partially by the federal government, partially by states through block grants, and where the federal government gives states a lot of flexibility in terms of who they want to be eligible for programs, what services they want to include, how they means test different groups in and out of the program. Block grants are literally funding that we give to the states to implement solutions that the federal government approves of, but that they determine how they go. Medicaid is a program where the federal government sets certain guidelines, and states can apply for waivers in order to see who they want to apply for it, what benefits they want to be included. So it's not all just the federal government dictating, you know, a one-size-fits-all policy. What I would say about the war on poverty is that it's been very effective in alleviating the impacts of poverty. We know that the SNAP program, which is food stamps, lifted 4 million people out of poverty last year. We know that 90% of the families that got SNAP benefits last year were families that had children, and that 2.5 million children were lifted out of poverty. Giuseppe talked about work requirements, something that was contentious in the 1990s. The Earned Income Tax Credit, we know, is a tax credit that has bipartisan support that incentivizes people to work. The more they work, the more money they get. And it has been successful in increasing the number of single mothers who work, increasing income, increasing the hours that people work. And so I think that the discussion of the war on poverty should be a little separate from the question of opportunity, because we know that most of these programs work. They guarantee people don't starve. They guarantee they can have affordable housing. They do work in that they solve a lot of the impacts of poverty. I think the discussion we have to have now is a question of how do we create opportunity so that we know they have food, but you know, how do they get better jobs? How do they get into college? And those discussions are a little bit different.
Well, I mean, they might be different, but I think they're absolutely related, which is if you say you raise someone out of poverty because they don't starve to death, not a great bar to set, okay? Raising someone out of poverty because they can go to the grocery store should not be the end goal and be considered success. I don't believe. I think that we are leaving millions and millions of people behind if we believe that because they didn't starve to death and we're allowing them to have a subsistence life, that somehow we have done right by them.
Totally agree.
Yeah, if I just may add really quick, most certainly, and I think part of why we do need to kind of going to maybe the later part of the discussion, Senator Rubio, when he responded to President Obama's plan for the promise zones, is that we definitely need to hit on the fact that bringing it more local governments, state or municipalities, they really do know better what's happening in their communities than the federal government does. And the federal government right now has created, arguably speaking, this subsistence type of effect. So this is definitely, I would kind of bridge what both of our panelists said and said this is definitely a global issue where you're looking not just at making food and housing more affordable for people, but this is something that really goes and expands to tax policy, how we're allocating resources, going to the root causes of the issue to stop the cycle of poverty, which can go to education. So there's a lot to consider here.
Absolutely. Psychological factors, geographical factors, it's a very global conversation. So just as a reminder, at the midpoint of our conversation, that's when we open it up to you all to ask questions. So we'll do so in a few moments. So go ahead and start thinking about questions you might want to ask our panelists. But at this point, I think we'll...
And they better be good. Well thought out.
At this point, I think we'll shift a little bit, pivot, as they say, to talk about the politics or the optics of this aspect of the conversation. You mentioned Marco Rubio, who made a statement shortly after the president's announcement recently that the war on poverty has failed, and he has his own ideas for, implements for success. If you look historically at other presidents, they've had similar social issues that they take on under this war on mantle. President Nixon launched a war on cancer. The Reagans famously launched a war on drugs. To what extent are presidents using, and I don't mean that in a crass way, but using this as something that's politically expedient, and to what extent is it actually born out of true change? Reed, would you like to take that?
First. When it comes to wars on anything, I think look where we got it. We're doing better on cancer. That's great. Not so great on drugs. In fact, we're starting to legalize them. So I guess you could say that we spent a lot of money doing that. I think, though, that when it comes to folks like Marco Rubio, for a long time, for generations, probably since President Johnson gave his speech, this has been a Democratic issue, right? This is the issue that Democrats can run on. This is the one that they relate to and they identify with and are associated with. And I think that is, if Senator Rubio actually wants to do something about it, I think that's a good thing. I don't think there's any reason why, despite 50 years of good intentions, we shouldn't be willing to try something new. It doesn't have to be for everybody. And it's frankly, if you are an American who lives below the poverty line, you should be offered the opportunity. Here, we want to try this instead. We're not saying we're going to leave you out in the cold. And I think also Republicans must get over, and I believe this is an institutional problem we have. We must get over, A, being indifferent to the plight of folks who live below the poverty line, and B, being seen to really be cavalier about the fact that people might starve to death. It's a really bad way to be looked at. A bunch of angry old white guys who don't care if the African Americans in the inner cities die. That's a terrible thing. And we shouldn't be for that. If we're going to be the party of opportunity, it should be the party of opportunity for everybody, not white families in the suburbs. And so if Marco Rubio, a Latino Cuban from Florida, wants to be the standard bearer for the Republican Party when it comes to finding new 21st century ways to tackle poverty, I think that's a great thing. I think the fact that most of these programs still operate on the same basis as they did 50 years ago, given how everything else works, I think is probably ridiculous. So I'm hoping that Republicans take on these issues. I hope we take on education. I hope we take on the fact that it's too hard for too many people to have jobs that they can live on. I don't think it should be a one-party deal because, again, have we done good? I'm sure we have. I'm sure there are individual cases where we've done good, but it shouldn't be the story of the one person, the exception to the rule that climbs out of a tough neighborhood and becomes whatever it is they become, and they end up on 60 Minutes or whatever. That shouldn't be an exception. That should be something that actually happens with regularity. Folks can be born someplace and have social mobility. Social mobility is a terrible problem in this country, and I don't think it should just be a one-party issue.
Giuseppe, do you have some thoughts about that?
Yes. So this is definitely, I agree with Reed, this is definitely an issue that the Republican Party can come to own. Why? Because the conservative message has always been, to harken back to AP US history, Horatio Alger, the whole idea of rags to riches. That is the message that the Republican Party has always put forward. But yet, because of either the way we express ourselves or the way the media conveys our message, or it's conveyed through the media, hasn't been really successful at saying, this is what we stand for. And for Marco Rubio to step up and put forth a plan where he's moving it away from the central government down to the states or in local governments, this is an opportunity for Republicans at the federal level. I mean, strategically speaking, it goes to the states, so then it becomes a more localized debate. Now, this allows conservatives to take a role, a direct impact on this, and then we can start pushing, strategically speaking, we can start talking about what are we going to do. CNN Money came out and said that while the top 10% pay over 70% of the federal income tax, the top 10% are only paying 5% less, only paying 5% more of the local tax. So then comes the question of how are municipalities going to use this fact, maybe something can definitely work out within the tax structure. Maybe lower the federal tax, increase the local tax. Why? Because the idea that Democrats can agree with is increasing funding. An idea that Republicans can agree with is making it a local issue. So this is somewhere where there can be a lot of compromise. And I totally agree. The whole idea that we're working on a 50-plus-year-old platform to have a war on poverty is definitely something that needs to be fixed. The political scientist by the name of Charles Murray came out with a statistical analysis that said that actually income and employment decreased after LBJ's war on poverty. Now, of course, this is a statistical analysis, which means that you have control of how you set those parameters, just to throw that out there. But these are things that have been put forward. This is a conversation, this is an additive to that conversation. And it's something that we definitely need to take into account. And at the end of the day, in my opinion, it comes back to education and what we're doing to increase access to education and how we're structuring that, which directly impacts the psychology of how we view poverty. I mean, I went to school in upper middle class community in Orange County, and even there, where mobility should be easier, our textbooks are teaching us are focusing too much on the problems. There's a lot of this a focus on how hard it is for people to move forward, and it's very sometimes the language seems very defeatist. And it's how we frame the issue that's very important. Are we teaching our kids to be empowered? Are we teaching them financial literacy? Or are we teaching them that there is no hope and that the only way they can get help is through a federally run system?
So Chris or Angelica, are Democrats losing this battle in public opinion?
I mean, I think, in Los Angeles, it's a very special case, I think, because of the large demographics of certainly Democrats across the county, but also I think if you see the demographics in the communities like those in the promise zone that were chosen, and a lot of the systemic barriers that exist for the residents and the community members in those neighborhoods. I think that for any party to look at this issue narrowly based on political ideology is really a disservice to the cities that we're trying to revitalize, to the communities in the state. I mean, Los Angeles has the second largest school district in the nation. We are educating hundreds and thousands of students, and some of it is not being done very well. And so, when the Youth Policy Institute launched their Promised Neighborhood, which is also a federal initiative of President Obama's, which is focusing exclusively on improving educational outcomes for students within designated regions of the city, some of our biggest partners and proponents has been the business community. So the LA Chamber of Commerce has been super engaged in figuring out how we engage students in a different way, right? Because we know that the learning that has taken place was really developed for a very different time. So we need to ensure that we're providing students with skills and with knowledge that'll prepare them for multiple types of jobs, and quite frankly, for the industries that are existing today in California. So there's a movement called Link Learning, which is gaining a lot of traction across California with state lawmakers. And one of the things that we're trying to do at the Youth Policy Institute through our Promised Neighborhoods, which is preparing students both for college and a career. So how do we bring real life work and industry opportunities to the classroom and blend those throughout the days and before and after school to ensure that students are really coming away with hard skills so that they can go straight to an apprenticeship program or they can go straight to college, but really have something that is going to prepare them in a way that is very different from what we've been doing traditionally. So, and those are the types of things, again, that we have seen cross party lines where people know that for Los Angeles and for California to be successful, we need to be able to prepare our youth to be, employable and to have be able to get opportunities to compete in what is now a global economy.
Chris, would you like to add anything?
Sure. I guess to step back a little bit to the question I was asked a little bit earlier, I think the idea that, Republicans are, well, I personally don't think that the issue of poverty should be a Republican or a Democratic issue, but I do think the idea that, Rubio's speech and new plan is, I guess, taking the issue towards the Republican side is one that's going to be difficult to believe for a lot of Americans. The House just fought for months and months to cut $40 billion away from the food stamp program. If we look at Rubio's plan, what he did was it had two major parts. The first one was to eliminate the EITC, which is one of the most successful anti-poverty programs we've ever had, and replace it with an income, with an income subsidy. That it's a policy that a lot of people support, but it's revenue neutral, and that it would just spread out the amount of funding we have to a larger group of people, so it wouldn't be an increase in funding, and it wouldn't change the way the program works. It would just spread it out further, and it devolves the program to the states, which is, I guess, it's an idea that's been talked about a lot before. It's one that I guess if we looked at it further, it might have some benefits. But the idea that this is going to revolutionize the way we talk about poverty and how people see Republicans on the issue, it just seems like it'd be difficult to swallow for a lot of people.
So now we'd like to open up to questions from the audience. So, anyone? Daniel.
My question is about income inequality, which I think is an important part of the conversation. The Oxfam report that shows that 85 of the world's richest people have as much wealth as the bottom 3.5 billion. The Walton family alone has as much money as the bottom 41% of American families. So I imagine that during this talk, one of you will probably talk about that study that showed that social mobility has remained the same, but the rungs have gotten farther apart. So my question is, how related do you think the issues of income inequality and poverty are, and how do you think we can implement solutions to close the wealth gap to also alleviate poverty? Because, I mean, obviously the funding has to come from somewhere, and if not higher taxes on the rich, then I don't know where else.
If I may, please. I want to take a stab at this question because I'm a student at the Marshall School of Business studying finance. I actually hold a current internship with a private wealth management firm. What does that mean? It means that we're working with, we're managing clients' money that have net worths of above $5 million. So to answer your question, yes, you cannot separate income inequality from poverty. But the important thing here is to realize is that because it's a global issue, simply, for example, increasing the minimum wage or increasing taxes on the rich is not necessarily going to solve the problem. It's a very good political soundbite. However, it doesn't deliver the results. We have an OECD study found that the United States has a more progressive tax system than, say, France, Switzerland, Sweden. Countries that are hailed by the world as being very progressive and very helpful, for example, to the poor and needy people who need medical care and everything. They're considered very progressive states. But yet, people sometimes, and I would say some, would want to emulate that. But yet, we already have a more progressive tax system than it is. So when it's looked that way, all of a sudden raising the taxes or increasing minimum wage doesn't necessarily become the answer. And you see a lot of very wealthy individuals, such as Warren Buffett and those families that you just mentioned, that are like, sure, increase my taxes, I can afford to pay them. I think we should increase taxes on the very top 1.01%. However, what happens is that when you look at like a Wall Street CEO that, yes, is making, then salary is showing that they make $600,000 a year, and that the highest marginal tax is 35%. Up until that point, they're paying like 10%. They're paying 10%, followed by the next bracket, which is 15, whatever, all the way up to 35. However, it's very easy for them to say that. Why? Because their stock options and those packages only get taxed at 15%. So it's very easy for someone like Warren Buffett, who I admire a lot, but honestly speaking, very easy for him to say, tax my income as much as you can, because they know that their capital gains are only taxed at 15%. It's a very good political soundbite, but not a very good economic solution.
Do we have any other questions? And I'd just like to remind you to, when you are asking a question, to tell us your name and if you are a student, what you're studying here at USC. Any other questions?
Okay, okay.
So cordial. I love it.
You're welcome. My name's Eric Dubry. I'm a Bachelor's of Science Music Industry with minors in Finance, Entrepreneurship, and Jazz through Marshall. And I'm also actually in the USC College Reublicans. I have a question for the whole panel, though, obviously bipartisan. So in relation to the education issue, talking a little bit about what Giuseppe went off of, and actually all you guys went off of, what kind of implementations do you think can effectively bring more opportunities, not just job-wise for those who want to go to college, but also give opportunities for those who might take a different path? Because right now, as we've seen, a lot of blue-collar jobs that were steady jobs for a lot of people that maybe college wasn't the path that they wanted to take or was right for them, have left, and it's leaving a lot of people who may not want to take that route or have that money another option that might be more financially plausible for their family, and at the same time, you know, put more people in the economy, more jobs, and put more money back in the communities and in the hands of families. So across both sides, what ideas do you think through the education system could potentially work at opening some doors up for more economic benefits for people?
Yeah, I'll go. When I was in 8th grade, we had metal shop in my public school. I guarantee there's not a lot of metal shops in 8th grade anymore. My guess is it's a liability issue,
Yeah.
but it's also a sort of a fundamental decision on the part of the country writ large in the educational system that to push people towards college. Now, we just had a flood in our kitchen like a week ago, right? And the guys coming in to fix my house live in my neighborhood, okay? The guy that cleaned out the asbestos, the guy that's building the cabinets, the guy that's going to fix the drywall, they live in my neighborhood. They're doing fine. These are skills that we absolutely need. We will always need folks to do those jobs, and they pay well, especially in California. You're a union carpenter or a union plumber, one of those guys, you're making a great rate. There's no reason why college should be seen as the only acceptable educational outcome. I think we're selling people short. I think also on the educational piece, I mean, you know, if we get people who get to the age of 15, 16 when they start dropping out, especially in places like LAUSD, and they can't read at the 3rd grade level, there's probably only 2 places they're going, in the ground or to prison. And that's unacceptable. That's unacceptable. And we got, you know, we talk about, oh, you know, Chris was mentioning, oh, you know, Rubio, you know, nobody's going to believe that Republicans really care about this. Well, we got to start someplace. You just want us not to talk about it? But, I mean, we have to start someplace. And some of these things are going to require, and I'm not saying writ large radical change, but we got to try something different because all of these issues, as Angelica mentioned, are related to one another. And it has to be a holistic approach. Things are going to work in one place, they're not going to work in another. That's okay. But let's not keep doing bad things because we think, well, we've always done it this way. What a terrible way to think about something.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll point back to the linked learning approach that is gaining steam across public schools in California. Again, it's an approach in which you take a look at the 15 industries in California where we know jobs are going to be needed, and you connect students to opportunities in the classroom. So you'll have a health academy where students in their English class are learning concepts around health, where they're working with the math teachers to design project-based learning opportunities that will prepare them. And it doesn't lock them into that industry, but it really gives them an opportunity to explore the options, of either getting some type of certification at a community college or going on to college, a four-year university, or, you know, are there other options where they can get jobs right out of high school. But it really applies this notion that learning has to happen in the classroom, but it's got to include what is happening outside in the world. So I think that's one approach that is being tested and has already seen some really great gains, because we know that when students are engaged in their learning, they're less likely to drop out. So we've seen already in some early research regarding this approach that students are more likely to go on from 9th grade to 10th grade. They're less likely to drop out. There's less rates of students that are being disciplined in school. I mean, so it's got all kinds of benefits But I think ultimately also we need to work really closely with the community college system so that they're also providing opportunities for students that offers them the chance to do something where they're going to be gainfully employed.
Yeah, just last thing. The community college system in California is the best deal going, bar none. Bar none. It is a great system that way more people should take advantage of.
And I'd add to that, just to make a brief comment, there's an incentive here in California to train community college counselors in a more in-depth fashion than they're currently trained to identify folks, because you're right, not all students are destined for a 4-year college, some are destined to trade school and other things, so to provide more guidance to young people. Any other questions? Yes?
Hi, yes, my name is Angela Rodriguez. I'm a graduate student in the Master of Public Administration program here at USC, and I wanted to take a step back to the promise zones. I know there's been dialogue that surrounding disappointment that communities like South Los Angeles were not included in that designation, which is partly because they were not included in the initial Promise Neighborhood program, which to qualify for Promise Zone, you had to be designated as Promise Neighborhood. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on how can we ensure that communities like South Los Angeles, though they didn't receive that designation, are not excluded, and essentially how can we do that?
So just to repeat, that's a great question, just to repeat it for any of you who didn't hear it. She was asking why neighborhoods such as this one surrounding USC were not chosen as to be part of the Promise Zones. I think Angelica is the best one to answer that.
Right, so as you stated, in order to be eligible to apply to become a Promise Zone, you already had to have had the designation of having had a Promise Neighborhood. And in South LA, there was no Promise Neighborhood designation. I think, though, what it does is that moving forward, this really allows the communities of South LA to begin to partner with the city and the county and with philanthropic agencies. There will be another round, it's been announced, of Promise Neighborhoods. So there's an opportunity for the community to come together and put together an application for Promise Neighborhood. And I think what it does also is that I think it also presents an opportunity just for there to be coordination around the resources that exist, the resources that may be available throughout the city that can be brought into South LA. So while we certainly understand the disappointment that the South LA community was not eligible to apply for Promise Zone, there's definitely, I think, an opportunity moving forward for community-based organizations and for the city and philanthropic partners to come together both to apply for a Promise Neighborhood grant and then also to see how else they can leverage resources to help revitalize the community here.
What does a neighborhood have to do to be a Promise Neighborhood? Like, what does that mean?
So to be a Promise Neighborhood, you have to certainly have the schools. It's an education-based initiative. So schools need to have some sort of metric in terms of the failing number of students that are not graduating, number of students that live in poverty. Those are the certain types of metrics that are designed. There needs to be a proven approach for how schools are going to be working towards improving student outcomes. So there needs to be a cradle-to-career approach again. So you're not just looking at what the K-12 schools are doing, but you're looking to see what are the early care and education programs, how are they linking to K-12, how is K-12 linking in a coordinated way with the community college system. Those are some of the requirements to be eligible for Promise Neighborhood.
Any other questions? Oh, over there.
I have a question for the entire panel. How much do you consider the war on poverty and the reason we have poverty in this country because of the breakdown of the family unit? And I say that because my sister is an unmarried single mother of 2 children, and she gets paid more money a month for not having the fathers involved, and it hurts her if she actually gets a job. So what do you think we need to do instead of just throwing money at the problem of poverty?
So for those of you who didn't hear Jennifer's question, to what extent are familial considerations are a bigger factor in the war on poverty than any other consideration?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure.
Good.
I think everyone agrees that like one of the largest contributors to whether someone has economic opportunity in life is their family background, you know, the education of the mother, having two parents. I think that where there could be progress on, I guess, making sure that, you know, we have dual parent homes, which are obviously proven to increase people's economic opportunity and standard of living, I guess we have policies in the status quo that make it very difficult for people to have those situations. So our prison policy, for instance, we have 1 in 3 African American males is in prison. So if we look at the African American community, it's very difficult for, you know, to have a dual parent household when 1 in 3 males is in prison. You look at contraceptive policy, most of the children that are born in low-income situations are born out of wedlock, are born, I guess, unintentionally. If we were to invest in solutions like that, it would obviously do a lot to, you know, improve the numbers of households where children are being born into stable situations and where they have the opportunity that they're lacking now.
Yeah, actually, I'm very glad, Jennifer, that you asked the question because it directly speaks home on a more personal level to me because both my parents came from a third world country, Ecuador, and South America, and we essentially were a single parent household. My mom was in charge of mostly being the breadwinner. My dad was medically disabled, so it was hard for him to find work. He was unemployed for most of his life, and for most of his young life, actually, and it was my mom's job to go out, and she started off as a cleaning lady, and she had to do a lot of, it was because of, it's possible, basically is what I'm saying, for a single parent household, basically, because she supported me, my father, his family back at home, and we're working 7 days a week, most of the hours out of the day, getting maybe only 4 hours of sleep at most. But because she had a certain mentality and because she had the education, she got out of high school in Ecuador with a business administration degree, which is what I'm pursuing right now, actually. So she had the know-how, she had the monetary know-how to manage her money and how her family succeed being a single parent. So it does come back to education. Another thing, though, to touch on Chris's contraception analysis of the issue, aspect of the issue, is that my mom, she made the decision, she's always shared this with me, that she made the decision to only have one child because she knew that that's the only, that was as many children as she could afford. She loves children. She came from a family of 12, but she could only afford one child. So she only had me, essentially. And it comes back to education because while I could very easily be on a campaign platform and say, hey, look at me, rags to riches, my mom was able to do it, everybody should be able to do it. No, many people can. What did she have that a lot of either African American households or other Hispanic households in needy neighborhoods, what did she have that they don't have? She had education. And she had a family that really did value education, a family in a good social position back in Ecuador. So what does that mean? It comes back to education. We need to partner with private businesses to push forth initiatives that teach kids financial literacy. To me, really what it comes down to is student finance. I've learned a lot about money management and that sort of thing, and it's crucial. And do we need to even go to the extent of maybe rewriting some of the curriculum to really focus this financial literacy out from simple as enough to how to balance a checkbook to as complex as how our financial system here works? I think is very important. Everyone needs to have some business sense to succeed in a country as capitalistic as the United States. And I think that that's what allowed my mom to be propelled forward and what would propel a lot of people in a lot of communities, along with, of course, with fixing the problems of crime and funding police initiatives and all that. I think if you start looking at it that way, we're moving forward instead of saying, instead of what has been a lot of, even, like I said in my classrooms, which is, oh no, rich are getting richer, poor getting poorer. Move away from the defeatist attitude, look forward to empowering people.
Thank you, Giuseppe, and I'd like to extend my thanks on behalf of the Unruh Institute to all of our panelists this afternoon, Chris Patterson, Angelica Solis, Giuseppe Robalino, and Reed Galen. Thank you all for being here.